Day 197 to 3:51 p.m. Southern outskirts, New Infanta Settlement, Infanta, province of Quezon. Far behind the front line, inside the newly constructed walls, General Faustino, who retreated first with the tired scouts, was listening to the reports on the radio with a grim expression. With the loud sounds of gunshots far outside the walls, General Faustino knew that the situation had gone from bad to worse. The members of the scout squad were also in dismay as they heard the report of the sudden deaths of many of their comrades. Being scouts, they should have investigated more about the creature even if it put their lives in danger. By what it looked like, General Faustino's plan to leave landmines to disable the creature became the trigger for the current situation to happen. However, the plan was formulated with the scout squad's initial reports. If there was someone to take the blame for this failure, it was the scout squad. While the scout squad thought of taking the blame, General Faustino thought otherwise. It was not like the scout squad did anything outside the protocol. In the first place, no one would have thought that the situation would end up like this. He also saw the creature from afar, and if he was with the scout squad, he might have given the same report. If there was something to blame in this, it was the goddamn source of all this mess, Mutagen. Mutagen had no specific effect or line of mutation to follow. It made everything a Pandora box for anyone still surviving in this chaotic world. Major, these things are not dying. A desperate call from the radio was heard by General Faustino and the others, clearly asking for further instructions from Major Bautista that led the soldiers in the field. ******* In the area of the battle, the soldiers were desperately trying to push the enemies back. However, as they already knew, these parasites did not seem to be dying at all. No, the soldiers actually managed to blow up many of the parasites using grenades. Their bullets were also able to tear the bodies of the parasites piece by piece. But why did it feel that the parasites were not dying at all? Boom! 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 Another volley of grenades being thrown caused a cluster of explosions in front of the soldiers. More of the parasites were blown to pieces, but as the smoke from the explosions dissipated, they could see larger parasites approaching them. Yes, larger. As it appeared, after the parasites in front were blown up, the parasites behind would continue to charge forward. Along their way, their sticky bodies would pass by the pieces of their dead kin. Those pieces of parasites would then stick to the passing ones, getting absorbed in their bodies, making them appear to grow. And those large parasites could be torn into 2 or more large pieces by the bullets, with each piece still alive and creating more parasites to restore their number. Of course, the parasites could not keep their numbers the same. It was because the explosions would pulverize parts of the parasites into smithereens that could not be absorbed anymore. Nonetheless, with how this was going, it would be hard to say whether the soldiers would be able to kill all the parasites before they ran out of explosives and bullets. Furthermore, they could see parasitized dead soldiers began to undergo mutation. Their bodies were becoming similar to the appearance of the previous host, being flesh-covered creatures donned with many fleshy tentacles. Before everyone's eyes, the bodies of their dead comrades were becoming parasitic nests. If left alone, they might end up increasing the number of the already hard-to-deal parasites. With the difficult situation they were facing, a question came from Alana. "Uncle," Alana called out to Major Bautista, "does the settlement have extra gasoline to spare?" Gasoline? Major Bautista was confused at first at the sudden question, but as his eyes fell onto the parasites, he immediately understood Alana's inquiry. "General," Major Bautista called out to his radio, "we need gasoline, ASAP." At the other line of the radio, there was no reply. What Major Bautista could hear was General Faustino's voice, immediately ordering the available soldiers. There was no need to question the Major's request. The General already understood and moved without hesitation. "Men, just hold on a bit more," Major Bautista shouted, also firing his gun up from the watchtower. Everyone heard Major Bautista's request through the radio, and there was no doubt that setting these pesky parasites on fire could be the answer to this dilemma. The low morale of the soldiers was rising as they formed their defensive lines firmer. That's a good suggestion, Alana. Major Bautista complimented Alana. The latter did not reply, however, as it was not really her own idea. Just a little more time and they would win this, but it seemed that luck was not on their side. Major. There are suspicious movements at 9 o'clock. A soldier that was in charge of monitoring the battle shouted. And to their surprise, the suspicious movement was far from the direction of the parasites they were currently fighting. Major Bautista stopped firing his gun and turned in the direction of the reported movement. It was an area still heavily covered in trees and bushes. And yes, those bushes were moving strangely. Shing! The source of suspicious movements stepped out of the bushes, violently cutting the leaves. Major Bautista's expression turned even more serious than earlier. Mechids! Incoming at 9 o'clock, Major Bautista yelled out on his radio. The sudden turn of events made the soldiers perplexed. It was not a good time for Mechids to suddenly appear. Furthermore, there was not only one or two Mechids, there were 5 of them moving out of the cluster of bushes and trees. One looked like a walking metallic jellyfish, with a rounded body and 4 elongated limbs. 2 were humanoids having 2 legs and arms, but one had its left arm being a long blade. The other humanoid appeared to be equipped with some sort of gun on its shoulders. As for the last 2, they were both animal types, being quadruped but having a model different from any animal on Earth. It seemed that they were drawn in by the sounds of the battle, and unlike the infected, or failed mutators, not all Mechids attack or charge towards the things that drew their attention. Like what was happening now, the Mechids seemed to be still in a scouting state. They had yet to see the soldiers, nor the parasites. But here, a voice entered Major Bautista's ear. Dad, let us handle those things. Colleen suggested. What are you talking about? Major Bautista asked, a bit agitated at his daughter's suggestion. Those Mechids are different from the infected. Even explosives could barely damage them. Dad, Colleen's expression turned serious. We can't get the soldiers distracted at this time. Don't worry. Remember the Mechid that Mark caught? We managed to get some experience fighting that after you left the base to stay here. So we are the best people to fight them here. But Major Bautista was hesitating. And here, Alana chimed in. Uncle, just concentrate on the parasites. Bessie already said it. We already have experience fighting the Mechids. Besides, even Mark said it. Our Gemini are among the banes of the Mechids. Gemini? Major Bautista was confused. What are you talking about? There's no time to explain, Dad, Colleen said as the Mechids spotted the soldiers. They're already charging at us. Without waiting for Major Bautista's reply, Colleen held Carla's hand. Carla. Bessie. Let's go. Colleen shouted as she jumped off the watchtower they were at. She jumped with Carla, with Alana following closely behind. The 3 charged towards the 5 Mechids, who immediately saw them. With the 3 girls closer than the soldiers, the target of the Mechids switched to the 3. And as the 3 ran, Carla, transform, Colleen yelled, not with urgency but with excitement. In fact, it was not only her. Even Carla had an excited smile. And as Colleen gave the cue, Colleen and Carla transformed at the same time. Colleen's body became covered with dark violet metallic armor. Her black hair and eyes glowed in violet color, with her hair waving like water. Unlike in the past, however, only the nails on her right hand turned into sharp claws, glowing in violet sheen. Her left hand held on to Carla's right hand, who was also undergoing her transformation. Major Bautista watched his 2 daughters, and his eyes were filled with shock. Colleen's transformation was not new to him. But it was the first time for him to see Carla transform. And to say, Carla's transformation was absurd even to him. Carla ran with Colleen, holding each other's hands. But as they ran, Carla's body started growing, similar to Colleen's size. Her body was covered in black armor that also looked extremely identical to Colleen's. Her violet eyes and hair began to turn black, with her hair flowing with the wind. And opposite to Colleen's right hand, which nails that turned into claws, it was the left on Carla. The colors of their hair and eyes were the opposite, and while Colleen was glowing, Carla was pitch black as if it was sucking all the light around it. But the most unexpected thing of all, they looked identical. It was not only their armor or transformation but also their faces and stature. Major Bautista already thought that Carla really looked like Colleen when she was still young, but who would have expected this? It was not wrong to say that there were two Colleens in the field right now. At this point, it dawned on Major Bautista. This was the Gemini that Alana mentioned just now. Behind the two, Alana was not letting herself get overshadowed by the two. Alana, who was only known as an evolver in the past, suddenly transformed. The white of her eyes turned yellow, with her hair turning orange with black and white highlights. There were also roundish cat ears growing on her head. Even a long orange furred tail with black spots extended on her behind. "I'll go ahead," Alana shouted as she suddenly overtook Colleen and Carla. In the past, Alana was far slower than Colleen as she was a strength-type evolver. Now, however, Colleen could not even chase after her best friend anymore. Shoom! A greeting came towards Alana in the form of a bright laser beam. It came from jellyfish-like Mechad. The laser beam came from atop its head as it bowed its body forward, extended its forelimbs upwards, and bent its forelimbs downward. The laser came fast. If it was Alana in the past, she might get hit even if she managed to react. But it was different now. With the new strength she received from Mark, her abilities increased further. Alana kicked her right foot, jumping towards the left. The laser from the jellyfish-like Mechad missed her. But then, the humanoid Mechad, with guns on its shoulders, began firing at Alana too. Unlike the first one that seemed to only fire lasers in long intervals, this one fired lasers like an assault rifle. A rain of short-beamed lasers came towards Alana. But instead of Alana trying to find cover, she began to move erratically. Before anyone knew it, her figure was already blurred as she charged against the rain of lasers. Each shot missed Alana. At this point, the other three Mechads also began to move. They charged towards Alana despite the rain of lasers behind their backs. But being robots with highly advanced artificial intelligence, none of the lasers hit their allies at all. It took a few seconds. Alana and the sword-wielding Mechad clashed amidst the rain of lasers. The sword-wielding Mechad swung its large sword at Alana. Alana, on the other hand, swung a hook with her gauntlet-covered right fist. Bam! The sword and the fist collided. Sparks bloomed like fireworks as the two metal weapons clashed with each other. Alana could not help but retreat due to the impact. Nonetheless, the Mechad was the same. But as Alana regained her balance, the two animal-like Mechads already pounced on her. The metallic fangs of the two seemed really eager to bite her to pieces. Instead of immediately retreating, however, Alana smiled. Shing! Shing! Two silhouettes, one glowing with violet light and one as pitch black as the night sky, slashed in front of Alana. Clank! Clank! Bang! Bang! The two animal-like Mechads slid across the ground, both with heads flying off to another direction. Alana stood up, with the figures of Colleen and Carla standing in front of her. Like what Alana said before, our Gemini sure are the bane of Mechads. Day 197 to 3:59 p.m. Southern outskirts, New Infanta Settlement, Municipality of Infanta, Province of Quezon. The beginning of the fight of Colleen, Carla, and Alana against the five Mechads was witnessed by many. Even the soldiers fighting the parasites could not help but put a bit of their attention on the three. The soldiers knew that it could be dangerous for their concentration to stray away from their battle. But given that it was literally raining lasers, they had to retreat further for them not to become accidental casualties. In fact, some of the lasers came flying towards the line of soldiers, forcing them to hurriedly break formation. It was already lucky that none of them were hit since the distance between the soldiers and the Mechads was pretty far away. But if they did not pull back their line of defense, it would be more dangerous for them. It was not only the soldiers that were faced by the barrage of lasers. Despite their smaller sizes, a lot of the parasites were hit. The smell of burning flesh could be whiffed off from the air due to this. And to the surprise of the soldiers, the lasers were quite effective against the parasites. The parasites hit by the lasers had parts of their bodies burnt to a crisp, causing the movements of the parasites to become stiff. Furthermore, the injuries the parasites received did not seem to heal or cause them to multiply further. It was strange. But looking at the burnt injuries of the parasites, the cause might be the extremely high temperature of the lasers. Major, you knew nothing about that? Jones Galley asked Major Bautista, seeing the Major's appalled expression. No, this is the first time I've seen this, Major Bautista replied. Alana's strength is one thing, but Colleen never even mentioned anything about this even slightly. So, they even hid it from you, Jones said, confused. But why? At that question, Major Bautista could only shake his head slightly. But inside his mind, Mark and the people in his base flashed in his eyes for some reason. They were a mysterious group of people. During the time he stayed there, while he learned many things, he also felt that many things and secrets did not reach his ears at all. In any case, Major Bautista could only sigh in relief as he saw Colleen and Carla behead the two animal-like Mechids. Looking at that, it seemed that they really had the ability to fight against Mechids. Nonetheless, his relief was short-lived as the following scenes happened. Clang. Clang. The sounds of metal echoed as the headless bodies of the two animal-like Mechids hit and slid on the ground. Their heads were also flung away in different directions. And for some reason, this made the other three Mechids pause, with red glowing lenses on their bodies focused on the three girls. This exhibit of behavior was completely different from the infected. The infected would not care whatever happened to the members of their horde and continue to attack their prey as much as they could. The Mechids, however, paused, seemingly assessing the situation. KKWWRREAAKK. Suddenly, the jellyfish-like Mechid released sounds that one would not expect from a robotic creature. It sounded like a roar of a monster and the sound of creaking metal at the same time. Then, the two humanoids, Mechids, stood in front of the jellyfish-like Mechid. The Mechid, with the long blade in the foremost and the other with lasers in the middle. At the same moment, the jellyfish-like Mechid made a tumble backward. Now, it was exposing the underbelly of its rounded body, facing Alana's group. Parts of the Mechid's underbelly moved, opening as if it was a blooming flower. And to everyone's shock, the Mechid's underbelly had a bigger laser inside its body. The parts that opened up also seemed to have glass-like parts, and it all started to glow, together with the barrel of the laser. It was the first time they fought a group of Mechids, but as how it looked like, Mechids were also different from the infected in group battles. The Mechids appeared to be able to utilize formations and strategies to some extent. It was something that could not be denied at this point. But as if the three Mechids in formation was not enough. Splat. Splat. The sounds of dripping sticky fluid splattering on the ground were heard together with metallic clanking sounds. Alana's group hurriedly turned behind them and saw the headless bodies of the animal-like Mechids slowly standing up. Black, foul-smelling liquid dripped from their necks like oil. But, of course, it could be anything but oil, considering how it smelled like rotting flesh. There were also the neatly cut wires protruding from the Mechids' necks, releasing sparks of electricity every now and then. But the point here was that the Mechids would not die just by decapitating their heads like how the infected should be dealt with. Nonetheless, it was not like decapitating their heads did not have any effect. While it was still a mystery how Mechids could still move and fight without their heads, their sight still relied primarily on their ocular sensors, installed where their eyes should be. With those sensors missing, their senses, especially sight, were impaired to some extent. It could be seen how the animal-like Mechids were moving slower than before, seemingly having a harder time sensing their surroundings. Seems like Mark's right, Colleen said, Seeing the headless Mechids, we really need to destroy their processors or the core of their AI if we want to kill them. But how can we know how to do it or where to hit? Colleen remembered the few days Mark allowed them to train to fight the Mechid he caught. He gave them some of his ideas to fight the Mechids. That was also the time Mark gave the alias, Gemini, to Colleen and Carla. He was a bit annoyed, though. In the middle of training, Colleen cut off that Mechid's blade arm. Mark liked his new toys. So, he was annoyed that the Mechid he caught got damaged. In the least, they knew that Colleen and Carla's claws could slice through the bodies. Killing them comes later, Alana replied. That thing on the back is doing something suspicious. We need to deal with that first. The two humanoid Mechids were protecting the jellyfish-like Mechid behind them as it transformed. There was no doubt that the Mechids now saw Alana's group as threats and were preparing for a stronger, dangerous-looking attack. Ignore the headless two. I'll take care of the one with the lasers on its shoulders. You two take care of the other two in front. Alana said. Okay, Colleen replied while Carla nodded in understanding. As they replied, the two headless Mechids jumped in their direction. The two sure could still sense them despite not having their heads anymore. However, the two injured Mechids missed as the three girls already charged forwards. With Alana being the fastest among the three, she arrived first in front of the Mechid with the long blade. The Mechid swiftly slashed towards her. Unfortunately for the slash received no feedback as Alana avoided the attack and ran past through it. And that was the worst timing for the long-bladed Mechid. With its attack missing Alana, it was open to any incoming attack. That was when Carla arrived in front of its already swung arm. The Mechid tried to retract its arm as fast as it could. However, Carla pushed its arm further with a bash of the armor on her right arm. Shing! Carla's pitch-black claws flashed. The next thing that everyone saw was the long-bladed Mechid's head slashed off and falling to the ground. But knowing that the Mechid would not just die from being beheaded, Carla swung her claws a few more times, leaving after images of her claws at every swing. And leaving a kick as her last gift as she retreated, the Mechid's body was sliced to pieces, splattering the black liquid around the bits and pieces of its body. Carla retreated immediately. It was because another rain of laser was coming in her direction. In front, Alana was already locked in battle with the laser-mounted Mechid. The rain of lasers was the result of the Mechid trying to shoot Alana and missing miserably. Although it was missing, there was no doubt that every shot of the Mechid's laser was accurate. However, Alana was moving too fast that she was able to avoid the lasers before any of them hit her. In a moment, Alana was dodging the lasers. In the next, she already stood in front of the Mechid. However, that was not all. Although it could not be seen because her arms were covered by her clothing, veins of red light were glowing through her arms. It was the racial ability of blood demons, capable of either buffing either their strength, defense, or speed. Hers, however, could only increase her strength and defense. Alana was one of the descendants of blood demons. Since the start, she was one of the two that naturally awakened during the birth of the Night-Evered Spirit Tree, with Emmy being the other one. It was also not the first time she used this ability, but it was definitely the first time she used it outside the activities of Mark's base. And with Alana's buffed strength and her new speed, Alana grabbed the laser guns mounted on the Mechid's shoulder and tore them off the poor robot. She quickly threw the lasers away and clenched her gauntlet-covered fists tightly. Bam! 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 In an instant, several punches were unleashed at an inhuman speed. At every punch, a mark of a fist was left on the Mechid's body. The damage in every punch did not seem fatal, considering it was no surprise, regarding Mechids could be barely damaged by small explosions and needed high explosives to kill. But with each punch stacked one after another, the damage and dents on the Mechid's body accumulated fast. Soon, the rotten black liquid was already spurting out its joints and gaps of its metal places as its body dented and broke from Alana's punches. And lastly, the jellyfish-like Mechid, which Colleen chose to face. Unlike the two humanoids, Mechids, the last one was in a completely immobile state. Its body was glowing as if it was absorbing energy from somewhere. The glass parts of its body seemed to represent something like solar panels, which might explain why it appeared to be facing the afternoon sun. But without anything else to protect it, this state it was in was fatal. Colleen was already charging towards it with her claws ready to dismantle it to pieces. Nonetheless, the smart Mechid knew that it could not continue charging its energy any longer. It moved, directing the energy it gathered into the barrel. The Mechid decided to fire its weapon earlier than it was supposed to, but it should be enough to kill the enemy in front of it. The Mechid aimed the barrel at Colleen. It was glowing, close to firing. But even if it had an advanced AI, it seemed that its reaction was delayed due to mispredicting the situation. Although it was ready to fire, Colleen's claw was already an inch away from its body. Shing! Colleen's claw reached the Mechid first. It was unable to fire its weapon as she slashed the Mechid in half. A smile crept up Colleen's face as she sliced through the Mechid's body, avoiding the seemingly dangerous attack from happening. But then, "Watch out!" Alana's frantic shout entered Colleen's ear. That was when Colleen realized that the Mechid she sliced began to glow intensely. Boom! The intense surge of light bloomed, covering an area about 10 meters in radius instantly. It was as if the sun suddenly bloomed in that particular area. Everyone was blinded by the sudden surge of light. Not only the humans were affected. It seemed worse for the parasites, which all appeared to start squirming like earthworms showered in salt. The explosion of light spread further, making everyone feel the surge of heat enveloping them. "Colleen!" Major Bautista exclaimed, worried for his daughter's safety. Even the Major was deprived of sight, but he began feeling his surroundings and hurriedly made his way down the watchtower. Day 197 to 4:02 p.m. Southern outskirts, New Infanta Settlement, Infanta, province of Quezon. The sudden bloom of light enveloped everything. And as instant it happened, the explosion of light vanished. Still, even though blinding surroundings only existed for a few seconds, it felt longer for everyone that witnessed it. It felt even longer for Major Bautista. Colleen was inside the radius of the explosion of light. As a father, Major Bautista was worried to death about the safety of the only family he had left. Major Bautista frantically made his way down the ladder of the watchtower. His eyes could not see yet because of the light, and he was literally a blind person feeling his way down the structure. The Major managed to get down the watchtower but ended up tripping down. Fortunately, Jones did not seem to be as blinded by the light as the other people and chased after the worried Major. He caught the Major mid-fall. "Major, calm down. Your daughter is safe," Jones said to the panicked Major, looking in front. The light had already vanished a few seconds ago. Everything inside the 10-meter radius that the light engulfed was burned to a crisp. Even the soil was charred, and the rocks were melted, looking like droplets of magma. As for the Mechids, none of them remained to be a threat any longer. The sturdy robotic menace that even explosions could barely harm were turned into melted pieces of debris, nowhere resembling their appearance just a few seconds ago. It was even impossible to tell that they were dangerous robots before. Even with just a few seconds that the bloom of light existed, its destructiveness was apparent. The only different place within the scorched area was where Alana and Colleen lay down on the ground. Alana immediately noticed something was wrong when she saw the jellyfish-like Mechid glow after Colleen cut it in half. As an otaku herself, Alana knew the possible event that could happen if something absorbed or charged high amounts of energy and was unable to discharge it properly. Yes, the result of that was an explosion as the energy stored was released into the environment. At that, though, Alana used all her abilities and rushed towards Colleen. Alana grabbed her best friend and dragged her away. They needed to get away from the explosion as fast as possible. But when the light exploded, it was too fast. Alana knew that they would not be able to get away unharmed. In the worst case, this would be their end. Alana did not give up. At the last moment, She threw herself and Colleen down to the ground. It was the last measure that Alana could think of. Looking at the area swallowed by that explosion, however, Alana and Colleen did not manage to leave the area of effect entirely. Both their legs were within the radius of the explosion, looking at the difference of the scorched soil. Alana and Colleen opened their eyes. Since they were facing away from the light, they were not severely blinded by it. What the two saw first was the contrast between the soil they lie on and the soil affected by the explosion. The grass under them might have wilted because of the heat, but it was not burnt at all. The two best friends sat up, and what they immediately saw was the silver-haired woman standing in front of them with her back, facing them. That silver hair, Colleen would be able to forget it easily. Artaneris. Colleen voiced out in her daze. The silver-haired woman looked back with a smile. I came to help, the beautiful half-Dewata half-demon said in an awkward voice. It had almost been a month after her tribe decided to cooperate with the military under Mark's suggestion. Since then, she slowly learned the human language and could now communicate despite her awkward grammar and pronunciation. You saved us? Colleen asked and realized that they were safe and sound. Her skin felt a bit sunburned, but that was it. Carla came running towards the two, worried. She was further away from the two and managed to retreat quickly. Her eyes seemed to be hurt, but she was also fine. The little girl deactivated her mutation, turning back to her child body, and quickly embraced Carla. We're fine, we're fine. Colleen tried to pacify the worried child. Why did you immediately turn back? You're naked again. It was one of the drawbacks of Carla's transformation. Since her usual appearance was of a child, her transformation tears all her clothes to pieces. They brought extra clothes for her, but all of their things were inside the settlement. Leaving the sisters aside, Alana slowly stood up and faced Artaneris. Thank you for saving us. It was heartfelt gratitude from Alana. They were careless and almost died. Even though they managed to slightly get out of the race of the explosion, both Alana and Colleen might have lost their legs. And it could be the lightest consequence of their carelessness. But to Alana's gratitude, Artaneris shook her head. Barely did anything. Artaneris said as she glanced in front of her. On the ground, traces of black mist had yet to dissipate, although it would be hard to see because most of the people here were blinded by the explosion of light just now. The half-Dewata then glanced at the forest not too far away. There, a silhouette stood behind the trees. If Artaneris was not a powerful entity herself, she would not be able to see the shadow at all with his eyes glowing purple. After he was seen, the silhouette stared at Artaneris before moving out of sight. The meaning of that stare was clear. It was for her to not say anything. Now I'm regretting it. Artaneris murmured in spirit language. If I knew that he was this protective of his people, I might have accepted his offer back then. But there was no use crying over spilled milk. That was what Artaneris thought. It was her fault for not being perceptive enough. Alana was confused at the reply of the silver-haired woman that saved them, and even more when she saw their savior gaze at the forest when there was nothing there at all. Colleen. Are you okay? The silence was broken by Major Bautista, who arrived with Jones. He could not help but embrace his daughters together. I'm fine. Colleen said, feeling awkward. But she did not say anything else since she knew that her father was extremely worried. Well, she already knew that she would get scolded after this, and it was better to keep silent. At this moment, the gates of the settlement opened, with soldiers led by General Faustino storming outside. That explosion of light was seen all over the entire settlement. The general had been trying to contact anyone, but no one was answering the radio. Thus, they could not help but make their move and go out in case that something bad happened. Of course, General Faustino did not forget another thing. Some of the soldiers came out, pushing wooden carts that contained a few metal barrels. These barrels contained gasoline, and the entire stock that the military had left. And there, things began to settle down. Alana's group was safe, although the three of them would not be exempted from any sermon because of their carelessness. Nonetheless, their contribution, managing to kill the Mechids, without any casualties, was something no one would be able to ignore. If it was the soldiers that faced those Mechids, who knows how many more of them would have to sacrifice their lives. The issue with the parasites also fell under control. Dangerous as it may be, that explosion of light sure dealt with the parasites for the most part. It seemed that the parasites were sensitive to extreme concentrations of light and heat, which caused them to become fatally injured and immobilized. The explosion of light became a great help in this regard. However, the parasites did not die and were definitely beginning to recover, albeit slowly. Without giving the parasites any chances to become a threat once more, the soldiers set the damn parasites ablaze. The soldiers saluted as the flames burned in front of them. Within those flames were not only the parasites, inside were also the bodies of their comrades that died in this battle. Because of the circumstances, a proper burial for those soldiers was unlikely. These parasites might have left eggs within those bodies, which could turn into another threat in the future. It was better to get rid of any potential threat within these gloomy flames. Artaneris also received the gratitude of Major Bautista and General Faustino for helping. Of course, she was reluctant to accept that gratitude. As she said before, she barely did anything. While Artaneris jumped to save Colleen and Alana and was confident to save them, they would all still be injured afterward. That explosion exceeded her capacity, although not enough to kill her. The injuries would also be superficial, and that was why she did not hesitate to help. But as everyone could see, aside from barely distinguishable burns on their skin, they were perfectly fine. Before Artaneris could do anything, there was already someone present to interfere. Of course, Artaneris did not say anything. With this, however, Artaneris received a heightened level of trust from the soldiers. This would be beneficial for her and her tribe, especially with their interactions with the humans. And while everyone was dealing with the effects of the battle that happened, no one was able to notice the western sword with a wavy blade overseeing the settlement from above. *************************** Day 197 to 4:08 p.m. Mountain Base, Mount Malabito, General Nakar, Province of Quezon. "I'm back," Mark said as he passed through the portal that Spera opened. Everyone could see that his eyes still had a tint of purplish glow, but the glow was about to fade away. "How is it?" May asked. "They faced some troublesome things," Mark replied. "They were careless. But I guess they were lucky," Mark added, closing his eyes and touching his eyelids softly. The moment he opened his eyes once more, it already turned back to normal. "You're really absurd, you know that." At the side, Spera chimed in, looking at Mark as she was gazing at an absurd being. "I thought, we already knew you. But it looks like you were hiding many other things." Spera sure was surprised as Mark urgently called her with his eyes glowing intensely in purplish light. And it was only May who was around him at that time. By the looks of it, it was only May who knew the reason for Mark's eyes glowing purple uncontrollably. For Mark to make Spera open another portal back to New Infanta Settlement was strange, especially since they just left that place this past noon. When Spera arrived, she overheard Mark telling May that Colleen and Alana were in danger. How was he able to know? That was a question that Spera had until she managed to deduce that Mark might have an ability to see the future. And it was confirmed after Mark allowed May to tell Spera what was going on. After all, if these kinds of things happened in the future, Spera's help was needed if things became urgent just like this time. It was better for her to know so that she would not ask questions. "Are they supposed to die?" May asked. Of course, she was asking about Mark's vision. "No," Mark shook his head. "I didn't really understand it either." From Mark's vision, Alana and Colleen did not die, and Artaneris did manage to save them despite receiving injuries. However, for Mark to have this vision, there should be something worse to happen. Unfortunately, his vision only showed him the scene where the three were enveloped in that blooming light and the scene after they emerged from it. It was very likely that the deadly part of the vision had something to do with that bright light. Unfortunately, Mark had no way of knowing since he could not control his visions even a tiny bit. In any case, it was better to prevent it from happening. And if another similar event occurred in New Infanta Settlement, Mark left Ignis to help in the shadows. "By the way, what is that?" Spera asked, pointing at the thing that Mark had on his hand. Some sort of laser gun, Mark said, raising the metallic weapon he held. There's two of this, but one got melted to scrap. I just wondered if I could study this, so I took it home. May and Spara shrugged at Mark's genuine enthusiastic eyes as he gazed at his loot. It looked like he had a new toy to spend time on. Anyway, they should continue on their tasks. They were still preparing their things since tomorrow they would depart for a long journey through this now unfamiliar Earth. Day 197 AA. Inside the white space that oversees the entire Earth, the hooded figure of the observer stood, watching the dying planet before her eyes. Currently, it was only her, and the I-19th was present in this lonely space. An observer's duty was to preserve the world it was tasked to guard until the day it was supposed to end arrived. Depending on the circumstances, whether they did poorly or due to some outside intervention, they could be replaced. However, the very same duty applied to the next observer to take the position. That cycle could repeat over and over until the world they had to preserve ceased to exist. Preserving the world did not only mean that the observer should make the world last as long as possible. It also included managing things happening inside it. A good example was when the population of a species reached more than the world could tolerate in its current state. When a time like that came, the observer could cull their numbers. Another circumstance that an observer could act on the planet was once it reached the end of an era. Like during the end of the Mesozoic era, where the observer of that time created a catastrophic event to kill the population of the current species to allow a new one to rise. There were very few instances that an observer could directly interfere with the planet they were guarding. If such instances were not present, all the observer could do was watch. Or, at least, allow their apostles to guide the current civilization in the shadows. That was why the current observer of Earth was frustrated as she watched the planet she was guarding die slowly. She could not interfere directly. It could be considered that Earth entered a new era. At this time, the observer had one chance to interfere and set the world on a new path. And the observer of Earth already used up that one's chance. During the fusion of dimension, the observer used her authority and the powers of the eyes to protect the remaining humans as much as they were allowed to. That was the one and only chance she could interfere in the current era. And now, she could only watch in frustration at how poorly humans handled the current situation. All of a sudden, a surge of black smoke appeared in this white, empty space. The black smoke began to form a humanoid figure with barely any distinguishable features. The only things that could be discerned were its glowing eyes and the aura of death that lingered on this being. Despite the sudden appearance of this being, both the observer and 19th did not seem perturbed. Instead, 19th stepped back respectfully, making way for the eerie individual. "You seem to be extremely bothered, observer." The eerie being spoke. Its voice was ghostly and gruff, and even though it did not sound androgynous, it was still hard to discern whether it was a male or a female. "You were already aware of the circumstances, guide." The observer finally turned around, facing their uninvited visitor. "Yes, I am aware," guide replied. "You are not the only one. Other observers are facing the same difficulties as you. Some were already dismissed from their duties after the worlds they observed ceased to exist prematurely. But even with that, there are rules." "What are you trying to imply?" the observer asked, definitely confused. "The cycle of souls. Even if you are this world's observer, it is something that you should not blatantly interfere with," the guide iterated. And to that, the observer and even 19th became even more confused. The only time the observer directly interfered with Earth in this era was during the fusion of dimensions, and thus, the observer could not understand what the guide was talking about. Sensing the confusion of the two, even the guide became slowly engulfed in confusion. At this time, the observer finally spoke. "We believe our recent interference, using our privilege, had been recorded in the Akashic records. We believe that it is within the duties of you guides to cope with. Or are you trying to find faults with our current actions?" "That is not what I am here for," the guide explained. In the following days on Earth, a few thousand dead souls are supposed to pass on. All of them had the end of their lives tied to one enormous event. As such, it was easy for me to notice. For a few thousand people to suddenly die because of one event, it sure was hard to pass. Even the observer would notice such an event once it began. However, for the guide to complain about it, their fates changed all of a sudden. The guide continued. This is not something that could just happen. I believe you know that, observer. For the fates of that many people to change all of a sudden, it should be something that only godly beings could influence. The observer in the eyes, for example. Even deities were still within the scope of the Akashic records. All the foreign gods had been chased off the surface of the earth. Only the observer and her apostles should remain to have such capabilities. As such, the guide came here to complain about the unusual circumstances. That explanation, however, made the observer and 19th realize something. 19th. The observer voiced out, and 19th nodded in understanding. 19th opened her book that contained the information of all things on Earth, or at least, most of it. 19th flipped the pages of her book. Unfortunately, since the pair of people in their mind was beyond their watch, 19th could only search for the circumstances of people around them. And, without a doubt, 19th found it in no time. She even managed to perceive the supposed future and the changed one. Blood demon kin Alana Garces, mutator Colleen Bautista, and the half-breed tribe leader Ardenaris. The cause was exposure to solar highly radiated energy influenced by the mechanical, infectious agent, Mutagen pathogen. The three survived a deadly explosion of the unreleased energy of a Mutagen, receiving minor burns and injuries. A few days later, Colleen Bautista would fall sick, followed by Alana Garces after a week. In 3 weeks, the half-breed Ardenaris would show the same symptoms. The three showed symptoms of radiation poisoning at first. Unknown to everyone, their bodies were releasing high amounts of radiation that would affect every individual that had contact with them. By the time the radiation emission from their bodies was detected, a third of the settlement's population was already showing the same symptoms, with the rest of the settlement being affected. It was not a simple radiation poisoning. Medical practices humans knew were not applicable. In a month and a half, the entire new Infanta settlement would be devoid of life. With the three survivors of the Mutagen explosion as the root, all living creatures, human or not, in the new Infanta settlement would perish in an extremely slow and agonizing death. The symptoms of the illness began similar to radiation poisoning. As it developed further, their bodies would slowly liquefy. They would liquefy beginning from their flesh slowly and painfully to the rest of their bodies. In the end, their organs would turn into black pus, which would also become the cause of death. Even after their death, the process would continue until only the bones, which did not liquefy, to be the only remains. As 19th iterated the supposed future, the guide nodded as it was the same future that he knew. What caused that illness to appear? The observer could not help but voice out. Any harmful pathogens on Earth should have gone extinct due to Mutagen's presence. At this time, 19th flipped the page of her book, seemingly looking for the answer to her master's question. However, she was not really expecting anything. If it was something undiscovered so far and in the near future, her book would not be able to find the answer. But then, 19th was surprised. It was caused by a violent reaction of Mutagen to the high radiation energy influenced by Mutagen pathogen. 19th read out loud. A similar circumstance happened in Japan when a medium-sized military settlement was attacked by a Mutagen, just a few days after the fusion of dimensions. Fortunately, they had a mutator that managed to identify the anomaly right after it happened. They only had a loss of 3 people. 19th then faced the observer. "I'm sorry if this even passed our eyes." At the apology, the observer shook her head. "It is not something that needed an apology. Although it is our duty, we can't pay attention to everything at once, especially now." Then, the observer let out a sigh. "The change of the future, is it Mark and May?" "It is Mark." 19th nodded. It seemed that he managed to foretell the ill fate of his people and prevented it. As 19th said those words, the observer turned to the guide. "That is the answer you had been looking for," the observer said to the guide. "What do you mean? And who are those individuals you mentioned?" The guide was confused. Who were those two, and how was it possible that they influenced the change of fate on a large scale? They could be Earth's hope in this predicament, the observer said with an anticipating tone. Fortunately, 2 candidates for godhood were born in this era. God candidates, you say? Surely, the guide was shocked. How come that I had only heard of this just now? We had our reasons, the observer replied. You should know that even other observers do not just blindly declare a candidate born in the world they were observing. Those words made the guide nod. Considering that the change of fate was caused by God candidates, the guide knew that complaints were futile. It seems that we have to cope with this situation once more, the guide murmured before turning to the observer. Since it involved God candidates, I'll keep my lips sealed. I will be going now. Without even waiting for a reply, the smoky apparition of the guide vanished. The observer did not say anything and just stared at the empty space where the guide stood just now. However, 19th did not want to stay silent. The guide just left without apologizing for the accusation that it made to you, Master. Just let it be, the observer said as she returned to observing Earth. The guides all across the universe are also occupied. It is not only Earth that is undergoing such dire circumstances. Unlike us who only need to watch and influence the civilization in the shadows, the guides needed to ferry the souls of the dead themselves. Hearing the consideration of her master towards the other entities managing the universe, 19th fell silent. Nonetheless, she was still annoyed by the guides' disrespect to her master. In any case, the guides were truly busy, even busier than the observers. The guides were also godly entities comparable to the observers. However, their duties lay among the dead and not the living. The guides did not have physical bodies and had no concrete appearance. People see them differently and they go with different names in different cultures. With Earth in its current state, the guides of Earth were also busy with their tasks. However, they were also diligent that they did not want to pass such a fate-changing event, preventing the destined deaths of a huge amount of people, without explanation. But as it seemed, things spiraled outside of their jurisdiction, leaving the guide to have no choice but leave and continue with its work. Unfortunately for the guide, this would not be the last time. 19th thought. Unlike figures of faith that gave birth to different religions of the past, Mark and May were not devoted to being a figure of worship. They would not stop in one place to strengthen the people's religious faith in them and would roam adventurously. The life of a god candidate was not easy. While they were outside the influence of fate, the world itself would give them countless tests until they reached the level where they were above the world. With Mark's personality, it was very likely for many of those tests to turn into a bloodbath instead. The guide should be prepared for many untimely deaths they had to ferry in the future. 19th chuckled inside her mind. Day 198 to 3:21 p.m. San Jose, Antipolo City, Rizal Province. The land was chaotic. It was something that could be easily seen in areas more embraced by the previous civilization. Ruins of houses, buildings, broken roads, and even vehicles were scattered about, all of which were mostly hidden by lush trees and vines of the spirit dimension. Because of the fusion of dimensions, new lands appeared, stretching the land that already existed beforehand. Many places were torn apart, even causing some of the human structures to be torn apart. It would not be a surprising sight to see parts of a single building located far away from each other. However, even with the ruins of the previous civilization still present on the new Earth, it was almost impossible to determine which place was which on the map. The terrain was nowhere the same as before, whether it was land or water. The maps that existed were now mostly useless. All it served now was to show the general direction. One of the only ways to properly and safely navigate the current world was by traveling through air. But, of course, not everyone was capable of that. Many magical races might be capable of that feat, but for humans, only a select few. That was if the secret side of the mortal Earth was not included. And at this time, Traveling across the sky of Luzo was a gigantic black cube, barely seen from the land below. That floating cube hovering across the sky was no other than the floating vessel of Chmetris and Ilya with the rest of Mark's group aboard. This time, the group was composed of Mark, May, and the three girls. Of course, Chmetris and Ilya were here, considering the vessel was theirs. The remaining members were Spera and Emihan. The three golems were also present along with the two blood children, Crimson and Oracle, who were always brought along by Mark and May in their adventures. Lastly, and the unusual member this time, was Feng Jiruo. Traveling through the sky in a secure vessel sure was safe, however, it was also undeniable that it was kind of boring. Although the vehicle was large, it was as large as a two-story bungalow at most. However, a fourth was occupied by magical mechanisms and circuits, and another fourth was intended for cargo. It made the area passengers could move around limited. But Chmetris already said it before. It was mostly an emergency transport vessel of the creator's laboratory. As it was not built for luxury, the most they could expect was comfortable travel. Furthermore, the average speed of the vessel was around 30 kilometers per hour. It was slow, for sure, but did not matter much since it was traveling across the sky. The floating vessel could actually go faster, but as its speed increased, so was the energy consumption. At its fastest, they could likely reach Bay City in just 10 minutes, using the past map of the Philippines as measurement. Unfortunately, that speed would drain the energy reserves in just 5 minutes. Considering that the efficiency of the self-recharge of the energy was rather low, such speeds were only applicable during emergencies. Fortunately, as boring as the travel was, it was a nice opportunity to relax. As usual, Mark, who was about to start tinkering, was stopped by May. Right now, he was helplessly lying on May's lap as she brushed his hair. It was not a bad thing as it did feel good for Mark, and it was a nice way for May to pass her time. Spera was also nearby, playing on the phone that Mark lent her. With her past as a slave and a member of Ouroboros, Spera did not have any experience playing games. As such, she took an interest in things Mark was playing on his phone in his free time. On the other hand, Emihan was lying on Mark's stomach, sleeping, making it harder for Mark to move around as he lay down. Out of all places, she decided to sleep there. It was not exactly bothering Mark, so he let her be. Feng Jiruo was sitting beside Spera, watching her play. It seemed that she also developed an interest in these things. Apparently, she was born and raised in her sect and barely had any interactions outside. Furthermore, her talents for cultivation were deemed mediocre, causing her to spend more time cultivating and not doing anything else. Now, however, she took the opportunity to learn about the world and asked to come with the group this time. Mark had no problems with it and did not reject her. Besides, compared to most people in the base, a cultivator like Feng Jiruo could be more useful within the group than their base. As for the three girls, children were easier to please. They did not look bored as they looked down the glass wall of the vessel. Although it was also possible to look around while riding on Schaffler's back, it was not a steady and comfortable ride. It was kind of hard to focus their eyes while Schaffler flapped his wings up and down. In this vessel, however, everything was steady. Thus, the girls could watch the sceneries below clearer. The girls seemed to be liking the view, even the mature Iola included. Once they were tired, they could play around with their new toys. Still, although the girls were enjoying the view below was not exactly enticing to watch. As they got nearer and nearer towards Metro Manila, more scenes of destruction could be witnessed below. There was no need to mention the current inhabitants of Earth that could be seen even though the floating vessel was flying high in the sky. From their current height, vehicles like city buses were just about the size of a medicinal capsule. Yet, they could see many, infected-looking creatures, much larger in size. Without a doubt, many, infected, had advanced their mutation during the previous month after the catastrophe. Without a doubt, life within the highly populated places on Earth before had now become hell itself. The higher the population of infected, the more chances of mutation happening. Just how it looked like below. Since the population of the infected within the cities was higher, there was more presence of mutated infected. It was good that Mark chose a good spot for the base, and even though they faced some dangerous events, the new Infanta settlement had a good location compared to many parts of the Philippines. The boring travel continued. Along the way, they encountered a few groups of flying infected. Most were groups of infected insects, such as flies and mosquitoes. There were also groups of infected birds. These flying infected ignored the floating vessel and just passed by. The reason was that inside the floating vessel, everyone's presence could not be felt from outside. Well, that was how it should be. Unfortunately, it would not affect Mark at all since he was using a different kind of presence to sense others. As it seemed, as long as they remained inside the floating vessel and remained unseen, the infected would just treat it as nothing but an uninteresting obstacle to their path. Well, the infected had no sense of space and would not try to evade obstacles most of the time. In fact, several of the flying infected they passed by ended up colliding with the vessel and fell to the ground. There was one flying infected that they did not let go, however. A regular flying infected, whether it be a bird or a fly, did not really matter that much. Mark might pay a bit of importance if they were mutated animals and insects with redeeming features such as strong armor or sharp claws. Those parts might be useful in being crafted into armors and weapons. A humanoid, flying infected, however, was of critical importance for Mark. There was a high chance that Mark could get a physical crystal with a mutation capable of flight from one with a high level of mutation. It was like how Mark and May gained wings due to a highly intelligent, mutated infected, with bat wings back then. Furthermore, these humanoid, flying infected, were quite rare. Thus, if Mark encountered one, he had one protocol in mind: kill on sight. And today, they did encounter one. Unfortunately, it was only had a low-level mutation. It even bumped into the floating vessel as it passed by. Nonetheless, Mark jumped off the vessel to kill it. Even though he did not manage to get a crystal out of it, its blood was still precious. In Iola's case, Mark had already proven that blood could become a catalyst for a human to become an evolver. It could be the same to create mutators. It was just that Mark had not fully tested it yet. If he could create a group of aerial soldiers in the future, why not? Aside from those things, the journey was uneventful. And to say, because the land widened after the fusion of dimensions, it seemed that they had to travel more than twice the distance they did before. By the time they reached the supposed ruins of Quezon City, it was almost nighttime. They were still a few hours away from Bay City if they managed to guess the distance right. What took their attention, however, was how Quezon City did not seem to be torn to pieces. Well, the outskirts were separated from the central areas of the city, but most of the terrain of the city was intact even though all the buildings had been turned into ruins. Looks like some survivors stayed here. That was what Mark said, seeing the strange sight below. Considering that the only places that remained intact after the fusion of dimensions were those places inhabited by humans, it was likely to be the actual case here. Even though the city was dangerous, it seemed that a group of survivors managed to live through it. The only question now was, were those survivors able to survive the earthquake? The possibility of that happening was next to impossible, however. During that earthquake, the city centers were the most dangerous, especially in Quezon City, where many high-rise buildings were located. If they survived by living on the rooftops of the buildings, they are likely to be dead now. Spera commented to the side. She had a point there. Inside cities, the safest places could be the building rooftops as it would attract less attention from the infected below. The problem with food and water could be sustained for some time if the building was an apartment type 1 or a hotel. But now that all the buildings were toppled to the ground, anything living on the rooftops should be buried under the rubble now. In any case, it was not the problem of Mark's group. Their goal this time was to reach Bay City and check on their situation. It was unexpected, but they reached the point where they could see the familiar outline of Bay City's roads after another hour and a half. Everything along the way between Bay City and Quezon City was destroyed and filled with unfamiliar terrain. Mark's group entered the bridge of the vessel where Chimetras and Ilya were controlling it. It was the best place to see what was in front. Nonetheless, it was already dark. They could barely see anything from afar. It was strange, however. Even though it might attract some attention from the infected, the military would still set up lights for their convenience. It was not only the soldiers that would need the light but also other people. It was even more needed near the border of the settlement so that the soldiers would be able to see any incoming threat. Yet, not a single speck of light could be seen in Bay City. Soon, the floating vessel arrived above Bay City, and to everyone's surprise, what they found was nothing but rubble. Day 198 to 6:41 p.m. Bay City ruins, Pasay City, Metro Manila. Splat. The sound of blood splattering followed by the thud of a dead body falling to the ground echoed one after another. It was accompanied by the sounds of fighting and metal clashing. Seeing that what was left of the Bay City settlement was nothing but rubble, Mark told Shemetris and Ilya to land immediately. Landing on site was not really within their plans. Beforehand, Mark intended to land somewhere far, where the people from the settlement would not notice the floating vessel. After all, witnessing such a sight would lead to many questions and complications. But since the settlement they were supposed to avoid getting seen was not here at all, the first plan was immediately scrapped. For now, the most important thing that they should do was to find out what on earth happened here. Of course, saying that there was nothing but rubble was more or less a figure of speech. Even without the settlement here, other things were present, roaming around. And the moment they landed and stepped out of the floating vessel, the group became the center of attention. The center of attention of the infected and Mechans, that was. And, of course, the battle immediately began. Clang, bam. Mark tried to slash a humanoid, Mechad, with his whip blades, the slicer, and the divider, but did not manage to slash through its body. As the Mechad struggled to fight back, he ended up kicking it away, heavily denting its torso instead. Nonetheless, it was far from enough to stop the metallic creature from moving. The bodies of these Mechads are annoying, Mark said with a frown. The strength of their bodies is inconsistent. Some are weaker than blood metal, some are sturdier. Boom. Another loud sound was heard. It was Shemetris, punching another Mechad, and sending it flying with its crushed body. It will help a lot if you stop holding back, Shemetris said to Mark. You're not putting any effort at all. Mark shrugged. Shemetris was right. It was not like he did not want to, however, he was amidst resisting something. Furthermore, a part of his attention was on his 3 daughters and their golems. This would be their first actual battle together. As such, he had this urge to watch, while Mark and Shemetris were dealing with the Mechads. May, the little girls, and Feng Jiruo were in charge of fighting the infected. It was not like there was any difference in the levels of danger between the two kinds of enemies. It was just that the pattern that the Mechads attack was far different from the dumb infected. At this time, Abigail was leading the fight of the girls like usual. With her speed, she could run towards the enemy faster than most people in their group. But now, she was not alone charging towards the infected. This time, the canine feline golem, Kaval, was running by her side. The pair of a catgirl and a feline dog turned into blurs under the night sky. Because the surroundings were dark, normal people would have a hard time seeing Abigail and Kaval running through the darkness. But, of course, the infected was the same. They were not only using their eyes to hunt, but they were adept at sensing living beings. However, the speed of the two overwhelmed their target, even though it was a level 3 mutated infected. It was about 2 meters tall, moving on all fours. Despite its height, its entire body looked like dried twigs. It also moved fast. Without a doubt, it was a predator type, capable of hiding in tree branches and would ambush its victims. While it was strange as to why a predator type was in the open, this infected became Abigail's target. Speed versus speed. It was Abigail's reason for attacking this mutated infected first. Besides, one of the most dangerous types of infected were predator types. It was due to the fact that they were rarely seen fighting up front. Just like now, Abigail's target was actually trying to run away amidst the crowd of infected. If it was left alone, it might attack when they did not expect it to. Sensing that it was being targeted, the mutated infected stopped retreating. Instead, it faced Abigail and tried to stab her with its twig-like fingers. The mutated infected's attack connected well with Abigail's afterimage. The little girl already kicked her body to her right and maneuvered to her enemy's flank. And with good momentum, Abigail gave the infected's ribs a nice and powerful kick. That kick would not kill the mutated infected, still, the kick was powerful enough to make it lose balance and fall to its right side. The moment it fell, Caval appeared and bit the mutated infected's nape. And with a tug of its blade-like teeth and metallic jaws, Caval cut off the mutated infected's neck, dealing the killing blow. Slightly lagging behind Abigail, there was Miracle with Inaba jumping in front of her. The rabbit golem's speed and leg strength were a bit superior to Miracle's. It was no surprise that it was leading in front of her. However, in terms of strength, Miracle was way superior to her golem. With those in factor's mind, Mark programmed Inaba to fight like this. Since Miracle was slow, especially since her trots were short, it was better if the enemies were brought in front of her. Of course, in a manner that they did not expect at all. Like getting kicked by a giant rabbit on their backs. As planned, Inaba jumped over the infected closest to it and landed behind the target. And then, with a short jump, about the height close to the target's neck, the rabbit golem kicked both its hind legs to the infected's unguarded back. And as expected, the infected was kicked towards Miracle as it lost its balance. Depending on the enemy that was kicked by Inaba, the result might be different. Some heavier infected might only stagger, while some might actually get thrown away and ragdoll on the ground. This time, the infected was a regular, non-mutated eater. Its balance was almost non-existent, and it immediately fell towards Miracle without resistance. It fell to the ground and actually tried to stand up to shamble towards Miracle, but before it was able to do so, the little girl's right foot stomped on its head, and then splat. While tainting the little girl's metallic shoes with blood and brain matter, the infected's head exploded just by the strength of Miracle's stomp. That was one down for Miracle. There were a lot more to go. As for Iola, she was standing behind her two younger sisters as usual. Her duty was to provide support, making barriers to protect Abigail and Miracle at times they were about to get attacked. This time, however, Iola had someone to assist her. Brynhildr stood by Iola's side. The maid golem was already in her so-called combat mode. Brynhildr's right hand had a sword while her left had a shield. She was pretty much like a Valkyrie that was sworn to protect Iola. Any infected that approached Iola was not only met with her burning barrier but was also killed with Brynhildr's sword. It was more efficient than needing anyone else to finish the infected blocked by Iola's barrier. With the help of the golems that Mark created, it opened more styles of fighting for the girls, not to mention being safer and more efficient. The little girls were not the only ones on the battlefield. Mei and Feng Jiruo were also there as their guardians. This time, Mei was not using her shooting moon edge as a sniper rifle but as a large blade. Furthermore, her way of fighting was far different from before, which only looked like a beautiful woman wildly swinging her sword blindly. At this moment, Mei looked like a dancer, dancing with the shooting moon edge on her hands as she decapitated the heads of the enemies around her. Near Mei was Feng Jiruo. Her sword flashed under the sky of the night as she also danced while fighting the infected. Her way of dancing was similar to Mei, although also different. In fact, she was the one that taught Mei the sword stance that she was using right now. It was the same sword stance and fighting style. The cause of the difference was that while Mei was using the shooting moon edge, which was a large sword, Feng Jiruo's sword was a thin and shorter one. There was also the fact that Feng Jiruo could only teach Mei the basics as she was not an expert in it either. As such, Mei developed those basics into a stance that was comfortable for her. Nonetheless, it looked more rough around the edges compared to Feng Jiruo's style. Looks like they were doing fine. Chimethris said to Mark. I know. Mark shrugged, looking uncomfortable. All right, let's just get rid of these pests. At those words, Chimethris noticed that something was wrong with Mark. He looked fine just now, but the next thing he saw as he looked at Mark was the sudden foul mood out of nowhere. Furthermore, Mark would usually see the mechids and the infected as research specimens. It was the first time that Chimethris saw Mark really uncomfortable to the point of treating mechids as pests. And as Mark said, he stopped holding back. His body blurred, turning into black mist. The mechid that was about to attack Mark froze as it suddenly lost its target. But then, crack! The mechid's neck bent to the side as Mark shoved his armored fist onto its head. But of course, while the mechid staggered due to the impact and was confused due to the sudden breakage of its sensors, it was still moving. Unlike dealing with the infected, just destroying their heads would not stop mechids from moving. And before the mechids AI recovered from the unforeseen attack, Mark gripped his fist tightly as the veins of his arm glowed brightly. At the same time, a greenish crystal floated around Mark's wrist, glowing while gathering blades of wind around his fist. Boom! Mark's fist collided with the mechid's body. However, instead of just getting blown from the impact, the mechid's body spun like a washing machine as the blades of wind spiraled inside it like a small tornado. The mechid's body was not instantly broken, but the repeated spinning of the wind blades slowly shredded its body until it turned into bits and pieces of scrap metal. Finally, the mechid stopped moving. Mark did not stop there, however. He then threw black flames onto the broken mechid, burning the black pus-like liquid that began to spill out of the mechid's body. As for Chimethris, he had no problems dealing with the mechids. He was not trying to dodge the attacks either and just let the attacks touch his body. The fully recovered Chimethris sure had an invincible body as the attacks, even the lasers, barely scratched his skin. And using his plethora of abilities, he quickly dispatched his enemies while letting Mark burn the black liquid afterward. After about 15 minutes, the ruins of Bay City were already devoid of both the infected and mechids. The traces of battle that ended just now was still scattered all over the place, however. How many enemies were there? Mark's group failed to count. There were probably several hundred. It was not surprising since the location was previously a settlement that should attract the attention of enemies. If it was regular people, they would probably die with such numbers of enemies, not to mention there were dozens of gigantic, mutated infected among the horde. The most memorable one was an obese-looking infected. It was about the size of a 3-story house. The moment Mark dealt with it, exploded into a rain of acidic goo. Luckily, Mark already put into his considerations that bloated-looking infected had the possibility of exploding and made the others retreat as he killed it from a distance. There were still infected coming from other places, attracted by the battle. The mechids was nowhere to be seen, however. With the enemies already dealt with, they could finally start the investigation of what possibly happened to the Bay City settlement. Day 198 to 7:09 p.m. Bay City ruins, Pasay City, Metro Manila. The battle finished, causing hundreds of dead bodies to pile up in the ruins of Bay City settlement. While it was declared finished, it did not mean that all of the infected and mechids were dead. In the first place, it was impossible to kill all existing infected and mechids in the area in one go. In the least, Mark's group managed to reduce the number of the loitering enemies to a number where they could investigate the surroundings safely. After all, they were in an area in the middle of several cities in the past. Even if they managed to clear the place of most of the enemies, for now, others would come wandering sooner or later. In fact, it might not take long if not for Amihan. The smell of blood and the sounds of the battle would likely attract more enemies. That was why, while Amihan was not participating in the fight, she was making sure that the sound and the smell would not spread out too much. That was why they needed to investigate the place as fast as they could. It was unless they wanted to entangle themselves with a never-ending battle. But before everything else, Mark painfully groaned with a frown. He was already holding onto his temple as if he was suffering a severe headache. His complexion was also pale. And although he was still able to stand, he seemed to be already losing strength. "Hey, are you all right?" Demetrius stood beside Mark and asked. Since the battle finished, everyone was already gathering outside the floating vessel. Even Ilya and Spera, who stayed inside, came out. Mark did not answer Demetrius, seemingly looking irritated. He then picked up a part of a mechad he was really interested in and made his way towards the vessel, with Demetrius following behind in confusion. But even though Mark was still far away, everyone noticed something wrong as Mark unstably walked slower than usual. Gerger. May realized what was happening. She immediately rushed towards Mark. And then, May embraced Mark without hesitation. Both of them had the blood of the infected on their clothes. It was sticky and smelled foul. But that was not important at this moment. "Thanks, Mayor." Mark put up a small smile as he felt May's embrace. With May's assistance, Mark reached the group faster, and knowing that there was something wrong with Mark, everyone gathered around him as he sat beside May on a large piece of rubble. Seeing the state of their father, the three girls also looked worried. Iola and Abigail were silent, but the youngest could not help but ask Mark. "Papa, are you sick?" Miracle asked, imitating May, trying to hug Mark with her short arms. "Master, did something happen to him? Did he get injured by something?" Ilya embraced and asked Demetrius, who fought together with Mark. But Demetrius's initial response was a confused shake of his head. "I don't think it's an injury," Demetrius replied. "I just remembered, but his complexion did not seem good before we started fighting. It just got worse over time." Demetrius's reply added to the confusion. No one could understand what was happening. Well, aside from two people. Everyone's eyes fell onto Mark and May. Within her embrace, Mark's complexion and state were clearly getting better. And at this time, Spera stepped up front. "Mark, can you explain what is happening to you?" Spera asked straight up. "I remember you have the same state back in Infanta." "I'm fine," Mark replied. "You're obviously not," Spera angrily replied. "Everyone is worried, especially since we don't know what is happening. At least, tell us what is going on." Spera was being pushy, which was very unlike her. But knowing that Spera lost her control over her emotions, it was clear what was going on with her. "So, you are worried about me?" Mark looked up to the angry Spera with a sly smile. "Wah. No. Spera fumbled her words. As she closed her mouth, not knowing how to reply, she angrily stared at Mark, pouting with her embarrassed blush. "Gerger, don't tease her," May complained to Mark. She had an expression of an older sister trying to protect her younger sibling. And in response to May's complaint, Mark shrugged. He would not be able to promise anything about teasing Spera. Nonetheless, Spera had a point. The people around Mark were worried because they did not know what was happening. The only person who knew was May, and that was why she reacted fast when she saw Mark's state. There was a bit of silence as everyone was waiting for Mark's response. But as if she felt uncomfortable with the atmosphere, the always silent Abigail spoke. "Papa, Mama, I'm hungry," Abigail said, rubbing her stomach. Mark and May looked at each other. Mark gave another shrug. "Let me rest for a bit. Then let's clean up and have dinner," Mark suggested. "Also, let's find a better place to eat." Mark looked around, and the others did the same. And considering the dead bodies scattered all over the place, it sure was not a good place to eat. There was also no proper space inside the vessel to eat dinner for the whole group. As such, after cleaning up themselves and changing clothes, they should have dinner somewhere else. With May's help, Mark recovered fast. They all cleaned up and changed clothes. As for the place for dinner, they chose the area of Bay City facing Manila Bay. Fortunately, while Manila Bay was now reduced in size, there was still a part of it that was water. And it seemed that the barrier of Bay City kept a wide area of the waterfront intact. And here, they managed to peacefully prepare dinner. It was strangely fun. It felt very much like a picnic in the middle of a destroyed city. it was all because of the ruins of Bay City. Unfortunately, it was already late. As there was no time to cook, the group had to make do with canned food. It was not like canned food was bad, but because the main cook in the mountain base, Trisha, was a professional cook, even simple porridge was delicious. Anyways, Mark started to explain what was happening to him while they ate. What's happening to me is a strong side effect of being an empath, Mark said. But how? There are no other people here. Spera could not help but ask. Everyone in this group knew that Mark was an empath, especially Spera, who learned it while being threatened by Mark. But they were unable to understand how it was a side effect. Empaths were known to be sensitive within crowds of people. However, Bay City was literally empty. They were the only people here. So why did Mark have a reaction that was way worse than when he was visiting Infanta Settlement, where there were still people? But as it seemed, Shemetris and Ilya immediately understood what was going on just when Mark said it was a side effect of him being an empath. Furthermore, Mark was more or less a transcendent empath. He might be the very first empath to reach this level as a mortal. To Spera's question, Ilya asked Mark, "It's the lingering emotions of the dead, isn't it?" And to that question of the elder succubus, Mark nodded solemnly. Empaths were sensitive to the so-called emotional energy. They react to it and absorb it without control. This kind of energy could be emitted by anything that was capable of feeling emotions. It was not limited to humans. Even animals and insects, and sometimes plants. However, that emotional energy did not need to come directly from the source to be felt. And pretty much like every other energy, there were things that could become a medium or trigger to be absorbed by something. One example was art. A painting could be made sloppily or professionally. However, even professional works of art could feel dull without the proper emotions of the artist, while a child's art could be more emotional than an adult's. And since emotional energy could be absorbed by things, of course, it could also spread unto the surroundings. The worst thing, however, was that, unlike most energies, emotional energy had a tendency to linger. The stronger the emotions, the higher it was likely to linger in the surroundings. Unfortunately, most of the time, the strongest surge emotions happen at a single event, and it was during a person's death. The more brutal and fearsome a person's death was, the stronger the emotions released to the surroundings. Furthermore, how unexpected the death was also strengthened it in most cases. And at those times, those strong emotions carried negative traits. Fear, helplessness, despair, regret. There were various emotions that could spread out during a person's brutal death. During the fusion of dimensions, everyone watched the sky in fear as the debris from space rained on Earth. And the earthquake demolished buildings, destroyed the land, and killed people. In Bay City, many people lived inside the buildings. The feeling they had as they tried to escape to safety but found out the floor beneath them crumbling was something horrifying. As they fall to the ground and get buried under the falling rubble, their emotions would intensify. With the population that Bay City had, considering it was a place with many tall buildings, the death toll would be extremely high. All of those people died at the same time, covering the entire Bay City with their emotions as their emotional energies scattered upon their deaths. For an empath, places like this would be an enormous torture chamber. It was the same for the new Infanta settlement. That time, however, the negative, emotional energy in the settlement was only enough to make Mark's mood sour. In Bay City, however, the effect on Mark was overwhelming. That explanation made everyone understand what happened to Mark. "You should have been more careful," Spera complained. "I didn't expect it to be this intense, either," Mark bitterly replied. But then, another question entered Spera's mind as she looked at Mark and May alternately. "But how come that you got better when Sister May embraced you?" At this time, it was Ilya that replied to Spera's question. "You didn't know, huh? May had a unique physique. It's what they called, body of void." "Void? As in empty?" Spera asked in surprise. It was the first time she heard about May having a unique physique. She was not new about physiques as there were people with unique bodies in Ouroboros. but it was the first time for her to hear about the body of void. Usually, void means empty, Ilya explained. But in the case of the body of void, it means more like clear. They then explained to Spera that May could deflect or remove any negativities from her body. This time, she was using her body to protect Mark from the negative, emotional energy in the surroundings. I see. Spera said, looking at May. You didn't tell me about this. It was obvious that Spera felt a bit disappointed. Ilya and Shemetris seemed to know May's body of void, but she did not. Don't blame them, Ilya interjected. They did not tell us either. We just knew since we had seen a similar physique in the past. That consoling from Ilya made Spera feel better. It was not that May did not tell Spera. Mark and May were actually hiding it from everyone. The dinner became a talk about Mark and May and their uniqueness. But it was not exactly peaceful because some infected would wander nearby from time to time. Nonetheless, they managed to enjoy the dinner. As it was getting late into the night, everyone decided to camp. With Spera here, they could just return to the mountain base to sleep, but it would destroy the atmosphere. Of course, while it was time for the little girls to sleep, Mark did not plan to join them. They needed to find clues as to where the people in Bay City went, after all. Day 198 to 8:22 p.m. Bay City Ruins, Pasay City, Metro Manila. The group set up the camp and put the little girls to sleep. None of the three wanted to, but it was clear that they were tired from both the travel and the fighting they did today. Iola and Abigail fell asleep shortly, while even Miracle, who did not need to rest, went and hibernated for the night. Amihan also followed the three girls to bed. It was not unusual since she's a creature that only had sleeping, eating, and playing in her typical schedule. As for Spera and Feng Jiruo, they were on guarding duty for now. They were being accompanied by the golems that only needed to stand by to replenish their used energy. It was a good advantage of Mark's group that they had 3 golems at their disposal. The golems did not need sleep and could keep watch for the whole night. If it was a regular group of survivors, they would need to have a person or two to stay on the lookout for a portion of the night. As for the remaining 4 people, Mark, May, Shemetris, and Ilya, they went off to investigate. They formed 2 pairs. There was no need to ask who was a member of which group in this case. Mark and May went to the southern parts of Bay City to investigate. It included the lower district, where the civilians were supposed to be living in the past. They chose this area, considering that they were more familiar with Bay City than Shemetris and Ilya. Shemetris and Ilya went to the northern side, of course. The scope of their search was smaller. It was something that could not be helped for the same reason of familiarity with the place. Going to the southern areas, Mark and May walked while holding hands. It was to lessen the burden on Mark as they investigated the area. There was no need to say that the lower district of Bay City had more population than the upper district. And, of course, the death toll in this area could be much higher. No, there was no need to doubt it. As they went closer to the lower district, Mark could feel the lingering emotions much thicker than the place they currently stood. The two of them walked carefully, making sure that any suspicious detail would not escape their eyes. Along the way, they had to deal with a few wandering, infected, in the area. They might have killed several hundred before, but with how large the Bay City was, it was impossible to clear just by fighting in one location. Gerger, the bridge. May spoke, seeing the sight before them. It was the bridge that connected the northern and southern sections of Bay City. The names were changed when the military turned Bay City into a settlement, however. The areas to the north were now the upper district, and the 2 southern sections became the lower district. The 2 districts were separated by a moat where only 2 bridges connected them. Of course, there was no way the bridges would withstand the earthquake during the fusion of dimensions. All that was left was the ruins of the parts of the bridge that did not fall into the moat. Unlike the eastern and northern areas, the moat here did not get filled up with the new land appearing from the spirit dimension. This, however, likely caused a great disturbance to the people. Without the bridges, the military, which had its main stations in the upper district, would have a difficult time saving the civilians in the lower district. This should have caused more deaths to occur in the lower district due to the delay with the rescue operations. Mark removed his attention from the broken bridge towards the other side of the water-filled moat. He could almost see the fog of negative energy that gathered there. And this feeling was familiar. Gurgur. May muttered as she looked in the direction Mark was staring at. She could not help but feel the uncomfortable chill on her back. At this point, it was not only the lingering negative, emotional energy that gathered there. Other negative energies also began to gather. It included magical energies. If left alone, a formless demon will be born in that place. Mark said with serious eyes. It was not the first time Mark saw this scene. The sealed demon he absorbed in the past, the deity of bloodshed, had the same circumstances at its birth. Ignis, his demon sword, was born in the same manner. Are we going to stop it? May asked. I don't really know what should be done there, Mark replied. I have a few ideas to try, but let's concentrate on investigating where the people here went first. Okay. May nodded. Since the bridge was destroyed and that thick negative energy lingered in the lower district, Mark and May decided to continue their investigation eastward. Mark noticed something and urged May to go in a certain direction. Gurgur, there's nothing but piles of rubble here, May said as they arrived. That's what I noticed. The rubble. Mark pointed at the pile of rubble. Don't you think it's piled up to be a makeshift wall? At Mark's assumption, May understood. The pile of rubble was actually a long pile that continued north. It might seem unstable, but the pile of rubble was actually about 3 meters high. Mark and May climbed up the rubble. They noticed that there were stable footsteps in a few places. The top was flattened as much as possible, seemingly created to be parapets. There were even knee-high barriers. Furthermore, the east side and west side of the rubble had different steepness. It was steeper on the west side and would be hard to climb from this direction. And from atop the rubble, Mark and May saw traces of battle. There were only bones left, but there were definitely lots of dead bodies in this place before. There were also traces of blood on the ground together with holes left by bullets. It was a trace of a bloody battle, the remains of the struggle of the people of Bay City to survive. Since constructing new walls would be hard, they used the rubble from the ruins to build a makeshift barrier. A wall of rubble might seem insignificant, but it was a line between life and death for them. Although there were still no clues as to where the people here went to, Mark and May found traces of the survivors that were here not long ago. Did they leave after the barrier went down? May asked in thought. Maybe, even before, Mark said. The radiation levels went down even before the barriers disappeared. That's why it's also possible they left way earlier. It was hard to tell how long these traces of battle were here. If there were at least a few dead bodies intact, it would be easier to guess. However, the infected seemed to have eaten the dead bodies, leaving those scattered bones. Why don't we check the previous military headquarters? May suggested. It should be destroyed already, but we might be able to find some clues around there. All right, let's go. Mark agreed. The two left the wall of rubble and made their way north once more. They were heading to the central areas of the upper district. They could have searched in the central areas first. However, it would be easier to find traces of people leaving if they searched the outskirts of the place. Now that Mark and May determined that there were no clues of people leaving through the south and east, they could move north. Arriving at the location, Mark and May saw nothing but rubble. They still had memories of the buildings here. In fact, the building where May's group lived before was just in the other corner. Everything was destroyed, giving May a few complicated feelings. One of the best memories she had was the rooftop where she and Odalina often sparred with Iola, Abigail, Odette, and Siegfried studying at the side. Those were the good but also sad old days. Sad because it was also the time they were worriedly waiting for Mark's return. Remembering those memories, May's grasp of Mark's hand became tighter. Mark did not complain, knowing that May was having some reminiscence of the past. They continued searching the area soon after. Like before, all they found were traces of people living here. The makeshift cooking area where pieces of coal and ashes were left. Holes on the ground which were left by the tents the military used. And also the garbage dump where the trash was gathered. However, the worst thing that Mark and May found was a wide area of recently dug up soil. At the side of the dug up area closest to the footpath were many makeshift crosses. Some of the crosses had dog tags dangling on them. A mass grave, huh? Mark murmured while May stared in silence. It was a mass grave. It was not surprising since making separate graves for the dead was not something plausible in Bay City settlement's situation. In truth, making graves was not really something they could waste time with. The fact that they even made this was clearly to appease their own minds while remembering the dead. A certain dog tag on one of the crosses took May's attention. With her enhanced eyes, she noticed the familiar name on it. She could not help but bend down to take it off the makeshift cross. Looking at the dog tag, May was a bit shaken. May brought the dog tag to Mark and gave it to him. Mark had a frown, looking at the name in the dog tag. So, Captain Della Rosa is dead. Mark murmured. Captain Edmundo Della Rosa, the leader of the 7th Rescue Squad under General Miguel Perez. He was the middle-aged soldier that welcomed Mark's group when they arrived at Queens Row Elementary School back in the first few days of the apocalypse. That captain was one of the good people that Mark would not forget. Their meeting might be short, but Captain Della Rosa had proven himself to be a good soldier, leader, and father to his son. Furthermore, while Mark was gone, Captain Della Rosa was one of the people that helped May and the other people connected to Mark in Bay City. To think that Mark and May would know of his death this way, it made the two wonder if Captain Della Rosa's son, Keen Della Rosa, was still alive. So as the captain's trusted aide, Irene McCarran. Mark let out a sigh. Instead of returning the dog tag, he decided to keep it as a memento. In return, he created a similar dog tag using his blood and replaced it on the cross. Let's continue looking around, Mark said as May nodded. As the two left, the new reddish-black dog tag dangled without wind. It was as if it was saying goodbye to the two. Mark and May continued the investigation to no avail. It might have been a while since the people in Bay City left, and the traces they wanted to find were already gone. It might have helped if they could find footprints or wheel tracks left on the ground, but with the infected wandering aimlessly all over the place, those things might have been erased too. They didn't even leave a note or something similar. May complained. They definitely did not think that someone would still arrive here after everything that happened. Mark stated the fact. All Mark and May found were traces of people and the fact that it looked like they left, bringing everything they could, like tents. But any clue about where they went was nowhere to be found. As Mark and May continued the search, they suddenly encountered Ilya, flying in the sky. She seemed to be looking for the two in a hurry. So this is where you two are? Ilya complained. Master, and I found traces of people that left towards the northwest. Those words from Ilya made Mark and May nod at each other. The two brought out their wings. The three flew to the northwest with Ilya in the lead. Day 198 to 8:58 p.m. Upper District, Bay City Ruins, Pasay City, Metro Manila. Flying over the ruins, Mark and May could see a lot further. However, flying had its disadvantages. All they could see from above were exposed locations below, and it would be hard to see things hidden under the rubble. It was disadvantageous for Mark's group to investigate from the sky since they were specifically looking for small clues of where the people of Bay City went. It was also nighttime, making it harder to see the ground below from the sky due to the darkness. Mark's group reached Chemetris's location for more or less a minute. Flying was definitely more convenient in terms of speed. Moving on land would take more time, given how many obstacles were left in the ruins of Bay City. Led by Ilya, Mark and May saw Chemetris standing on the northwest edge of the upper district of Bay City. Here, the moat was covered, unlike the southern area of the upper district. The location where Chemetris stood was clearly the boundary of the barrier. It was distinguishable by the sudden change of terrain that was different from the ruins of Bay City. From the sky, Mark and May could not see anything strange. Shemetris was just standing at the edge of what seemed to be a forest. Although there was a bit of space between the trees, all they could see under the shade was the overgrown grass. "Master, we're here," Ilya gleefully called out as she began to land. As usual, she had this carefree behavior even in the current situation. This made it questionable if the woman that ruined Felicia's life was really the same person. "What did you find?" Mark asked. "There," Shemetris replied, pointing at the very same overgrown grass that Mark and May saw from above. Mark turned his attention to the overgrown grass. To say, it did not look any different from most of the grass and bushes they could see nowadays. But the point was there. The overgrown grass one could see everywhere did not exist before. Many just appeared during the fusion of dimensions. However, a lot grew recently at a fast pace due to the changes in Earth. Mark kneeled down and pushed the grass aside, and there, covered by the grass and ruined by the roots of the plants, a footprint under the overgrown grass. If it was just a single footprint, it would not last long and be covered by erosion and other factors of nature. However, there was not just one. In just the patch of grass that Mark pushed away, there were several footmarks under it. Some of the prints even overlapped each other, having different sizes and depths. "Step aside for a bit," Mark said as he brought out a crystal floating around his wrist. Both Shemetris and Ilya were familiar with this crystal. The wind manipulation mental crystal. After all, it came from the guy that Ilya sacrificed to create a new body for her master. The wind manipulation mental crystal glowed with Mark's command. With a wave of his hand, a blade of wind flew from him, cutting off the overgrown grass in front of them. And lastly, Mark created a small vortex of wind, causing the leaves of the trees to sway. The vortex began to vacuum the cut grass away, revealing the ground underneath. After Mark pushed the grass away, it was easier to investigate the location, and to say, in just the small area they cleaned, hundreds of different footprints could be seen. Looking around further, Mark was a bit bewildered. There were also tracks left by the wheels of a vehicle. It was not just one car either but a few different ones. "Cars?" May voiced out, also surprised. Their surprise was understandable. The earthquake a month ago did not only destroy buildings. Even vehicles were badly damaged for various reasons. Some were buried in the rubble, while others were swallowed by the land. The changes in the topography during the fusion of dimensions caused lots of damages. It was not only to the vehicles but every existing in the mortal plane. "It must be that guy," Mark said. "Their head mechanic, Raymond." "I don't know him," May replied, making Mark look at her in askance. "I don't really interact with the people that much before. The transactions for the repairs when our car got damaged were always handled by Odell. And I really can't go out that much back then." That was true. Because of May's circumstances, her interactions with the people in Bay City were kept minimal. Even if the man called Raymond was an important figure in Bay City, May never met him. "But maybe their cars did not get damaged that much," Mark suddenly said, changing the topic. "They managed to create that super metal for their vehicles, after all." Mark remembered the modified Humvee that he saw in the workshop of Bay City before. If they had more vehicles refitted with that metal, they should be able to salvage more vehicles to fix and use. May also heard of that. Unfortunately, that new metal was exclusive for military use and was not given to civilians to modify their vehicles. If it was allowed, Odalina might have requested the MB Sprinter to be refitted like so. At this time, Ilya and Shemetris joined the conversation. If they went this direction, where could they be heading? Shemetris said, looking at the expanse of the forested area before them. "I have a guess, but let me look for a bit," Mark said before opening his wings and flying up to the sky. Above, Mark observed the area where they found the footprints and vehicle tracks before panning his eyes to the locations beyond. Mark also flew down, going a bit north and northwest, investigating the forest thoroughly. Mark even flew above the new land that now occupied a large area of Manila Bay. As Mark flew, he noticed something. There were some differences between the overgrown grass in the area where Chimedris found the footprints compared to other places, mainly because the grass there appeared to be shorter than others. Looking around, Mark found the trail of shorter grass. It made it easier for Mark to determine what direction the people of Bay City went to. But why was this trail of grass short? It was definitely because it was the place where several hundreds of people and vehicles passed through. The people might have tried to cut off the grass as they passed by. Even if they did not, those hundreds of people were more than enough to trample the grass, half dead if not entirely dead. It would cause a delay in the growth of the grass, causing this scene that Mark was now following. In fact, it was also possible to find trails where the infected often passed the same way. After about 5 minutes of flying around, Mark returned to the place where May, Chimedris, and Ilya waited. Compared to when Mark left, however, the place became bloody. A few dead corpses were lying here and there. Mark landed and looked around. Did the some infected appear? Mark asked. They likely got attracted here when you used wind magic earlier. Chimedris replied. Mark nodded in understanding. It could not be helped, however. Gerger, did you find anything? May approached Mark and asked. I did, Mark replied. Looks like the people moved west. Mark turned in the direction of the new land over the past Manila Bay as he said that. West? Ilya spoke. Is there something there? Or did they just flee from the city? I don't really know, Mark replied with a shake of his head, but there's a possibility. Possibility of what? Ilya asked further. Southwest of here, directly on the other side of Manila Bay, there's the Corregidor Island. It's one of the locations of the main military settlements in the country. Mark answered. Southwest, huh? But why did they go northwest? Ilya could not help but say, considering they were currently on the northwest side of Bay City. It might look roundabout, but Corregidor Island is closer going through the province of Bataan, which is on the north side of the island. Also, half of Manila Bay is now occupied by land. It's easier to travel through here than going south. Mark explained. The question here is why they decided to go there. It was the real mystery here. Why would the people of Bay City go there? Bay City was destroyed. It was more likely for the people to think that other places had the same state. Furthermore, Corregidor Island was surrounded by water. An earthquake of high magnitude would have many effects on those kinds of locations. Yet, it was highly possible that the people of Bay City went there. Of course, it was also possible that they just fled Bay City due to danger. However, it was better to start with a possible lead than look blindly. Looks like we found our lead, Chimedris said. It's not a concrete lead, but it's better than nothing, Mark replied. I don't know whether we will leave immediately tomorrow, but we should rest for the night. That was the end of the investigation, at least for today. They already had the lead, but it did not require Mark's group to hurry. At this moment, there was another point of interest here in Bay City for Mark to investigate. Yes, it was the lower district of Bay City. Currently, the place was negative energy was threateningly concentrated there. Sooner or later, it would cause the birth of a formless demon. A formless demon might not sound threatening, but it could spell disaster in many ways. Even more, if a formless demon, capable of controlling miasma, was the one to appear there. In any case, that was the work for tomorrow. For now, it was time for the group to rest. The four returned to the camp. Spera and Feng Jiro welcomed them back. Mark relayed the findings of the investigation since Spera asked. Feng Jiro also listened carefully. And for Mark's plans for tomorrow, there was no opposition when Mark mentioned dealing with the negative energy in the lower district. In fact, Chimedris, Ilya, Spera, and Feng Jiro strongly supported Mark's idea. They all agreed that it would be dangerous to leave it alone now that Mark and May found it. It was as expected for people with mysterious backgrounds. They all knew the intensity of danger of letting the birth of a new, formless demon. ******************************** Day 199 to 7:02 a.m. Upper District, Bay City Ruins, Pasay City, Metro Manila. The night passed, well, not peacefully. Past midnight, a few evolved animals attacked. It was hard to determine what kind of animals the attackers were, although they looked canine, even close to wolves. However, knowing that there were no local species of wolves in the country, it was very likely that they were evolved dogs. There were 10 of the evolved dogs, but they were dealt with without problems, since these were evolved animals, and not infected. Mark just used his emotion induction on the attackers and froze them with fear. The corpses of the animals were not thrown away, however. They might be dogs in the past, but now, they were a good source of meat. It became a bit of work in the middle of the night, but Mark drained the blood of the evolved dogs nicely. After waking up, Mark and May stored the blood-drained carcasses inside their rings. They also ate breakfast first. And then, they rode the floating vessel. It then flew directly above the lower district. When they arrived at the location, everyone could feel the swirling negative energy below. Even the anti-god weapon, Shemetris, could not help but say as he saw and felt the situation below. "This is bad," Shemetris warned and turned to Mark. "It's good that you found this. The negative energy is already solidifying. It will only take a few days before a formless demon is born from this place." Hearing that, everyone could not help but feel lucky. A formless demon would definitely cause a disaster, especially now when magical energy was now abundant everywhere on Earth. Day 199 to 9:10 a.m. Lower District, Bay City Ruins, Pasay City, Metro Manila. From the sky, looking below the ruins of the lower district, it felt strange. Everyone could feel the swirling negative energy, and in fact, although hard to prove, everyone could see it. The negative energy could be seen, but not objectively. It was as if the ruins were covered in a sort of black haze that both existed and did not. It was a scene that was hard to describe in human terms, especially with only the 5 senses that regular humans had. "We better deal with this now, then," Mark said. "Are you going to use your miasma to absorb that?" Ilya asked Mark. "I'll tell you this, but I won't recommend doing that." Those words from the elder succubus caused confusion in the group. Everyone here already knew that Mark could use and control miasma. Feng Jiruo, who stayed in the mountain base for a while now, was not an exception. She already knew of this ability of Mark. After all, everyone in the base knew of Mark's ability to control miasma. The reason for this was, of course, the battle between Mark and the Great One. It was during the attack on the mountain base by the Chinese branch of Ouroboros. After that happened, it was hard not to fill the people's curiosity without telling the truth. However, in return for telling the truth, it bolstered the people's respect and trust in Mark's strength. In any case, it was already a tacit understanding to everyone in the base to not disclose such information to outsiders. Even Major Bautista and his entourage did not know of such capabilities of Mark. Feng Jiruo was an exception, however. The time she stayed in the mountain base alongside her interactions with the residents made her one of them already. Back to the subject at hand, it was unexpected for Ilya to give out such a remark. And, of course, it ends with a question. "Why?" Mark asked. It was true that one of the ideas that Mark had was using his miasma. This was one of the easiest methods to absorb the swirling negative energy Mark had at hand. However, Mark could not understand what Ilya was trying to say. "It seems you don't know," Ilya replied before turning to Shemetris. Upon their eye contact, Shemetris nodded, urging Ilya to continue. "Have you ever considered why formless demons had such twisted mentalities? The very moment they exist, their entire being is already filled with malice. At first, one would think that it's because of how they were born, the negative energy, and the events that caused that energy to gather. But that's not the actual case and just the partial truth. Yes, they were born with that energy, but their nature should not be influenced by just negative energy. Or else, anything that harbored negative energies on their bodies should have been inherently evil." "Just go straight to the point," Mark interjected. "Ahem." Ilya faked a cough awkwardly. "What I mean is that the thing that attracted the negative energy here is the emotional sentiments left by the dead. Those emotional sentiments are what you called emotional energy. The negative energy and emotional energy are both connected and separate. And from what we know, miasma can absorb emotional energy, but can't convert it into miasma. It is the same case for formless demons. However, that emotional energy they absorbed did not matter much to them because they were filled with malice since the start. You, however, not only you're not a formless demon, worse, you're even an empath. Absorbing these malicious emotional sentiments directly will corrode your mind. In this case, it is better to leave this to my master. Ilya added as she turned to Chemετris. My body is composed of both holy and demonic creatures, Chemετris spoke. I can release enough holy energy to disperse the gathered negative energy. It won't be able to completely disperse the emotional sentiments, but it would be weakened enough to stop gathering negative energy in this place. At this point, Spera and Feng Jiruo were confused about what Chemετris said. After all, the two had never seen the real appearance of the humanoid chimera. Still, if Chemετris could do something without the chance of danger, it would be better than Mark's miasma. To that plan, however, nah, that's counterproductive for me. Mark shrugged. It would be a waste to just disperse all that gathered energy. You are seriously trying to become mentally disabled. You might end up berserk. Even if we are here, we are not sure that we can stop you without consequences. Ilya replied, exasperated at Mark's foolishness. Who said that I'll be absorbing that with my miasma? Mark shook his head with a sigh. I still have another way. It's a bit time-consuming than using miasma, or dispersing it with holy energy, but it will allow us to make use of the negative energy and probably the emotional energy in the future. It was Ilya's turn to be confused. Chemετris only looked at Mark, waiting for him to tell his plan. Well, my method is kinda complicated to explain. So, just watch, alright? Mark said. Are you sure that your method will be safe? Spera asked Mark the question Feng Jiruo, Chemetris, and Ilya had. As for Mei, Amihan, and the little girls, they already had a vague idea of Mark's plan as he was already unequipping the gauntlet on his right arm. Mark nodded to Spera in response. Just lower the vessel as much as you could, Mark told Chemetris. I'll deal with it on the platform outside the door. Mark then turned to Mei. We'll go together, all right? Yes. Mei replied with a nod without question or hesitation. Still in the dark, they followed Mark's instructions. The floating vessel was lowered into the swirling negative energy. Unfortunately, Chemetris could not lower the vessel that much as everyone, even Ilya, began to feel uncomfortable. Mark stepped out with Mei, holding each other's hands. Looking at the hazy surroundings, Mei shivered. Even with her unique physique, she was still affected. Moreover, it hurts. Help. Mommy. Ooh. No. Ah. All sorts of voices began to enter Mei's ear. Most of them were calling for help. Others were crying in pain. The despair, helplessness, fear, sadness. All sorts of emotions came swirling in. Mei was shaken. All the emotions from the voices felt as if it was her own. Don't listen to it. Suddenly, a voice entered her right ear. It drowned all the other voices away, clearing her mind. Mei could not help but turn to the source of the voice. It was Mark, whose eyes were glowing red as a blood moon. Mei realized that Mark knew what happened to her. Gurgur, those voices. I know. It's like ghosts whispering in your ear, right? This happens when the emotional energy in the area is too strong. This is what I have had to deal with ever since we parted with Chemetris and Ilya for the first time. It only happens in places like this where the emotional energy in the surroundings are too strong, like what happened yesterday. It slowly shakes your mind and puts their emotions as if it's your own. Hearing Mark's explanation, Mei looked at Mark with a pitiful expression. Don't look at me like that. Mark sighed. Being a powerful empath is not easy, but you're here with me, right? Mei nodded, tightening her grip on Mark's hand. Anyway, let's start, Mark said as he raised his right arm and stretched it forward. I'm leaving this to you, Psy Crystal. As Mark said that, The psi crystal, embedded on his arm, glowed in response. The swirling energy in the surroundings changed direction as it slowly gathered towards Mark's arm, specifically into the psi crystal. And as Mark said, the process was slower than the first two methods they had. However, the amount of negative energy that was enough to birth a formless demon was too precious to pass. Not to mention that this negative energy was actually a kind of corrupted magical energy. The psi crystal could absorb it and turn it into attributed crystals. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. The process sure took a while. After 2 hours of waiting, the negative energy in the surroundings sure had decreased. And unexpectedly, it was the same for the emotional energy in the surroundings. Mark was also surprised at this development. After all, he had never seen or felt the psi crystal absorb any emotional energy in the past. Maybe it was only applicable to extreme amounts of emotional energy. After all, the emotional energy here was enough to give birth to a formless demon. And another half-hour passed. Mark put down his numb right arm. Raising it in front of him for more than 2 hours sure was tiring. However, he could not let it down. If he did, the negative energy would gather closer to him and cause trouble. Nonetheless, they were finished here. The negative energy was no more, and the emotional energy left was barely noticeable. For the harvest, Mark got 5 murky-colored crystals. The crystals looked like they were stuffed with black mud and sewage water. And even though in crystal form, the crystals that were made from both negative energy and malicious, emotional energy, were uncomfortable to look at for some reason. "You really did it, huh?" Ilias said as Mark and May returned inside the vessel. The two did not reply, however. Mark and May were tired since they stood still for 2.5 hours straight, not to mention Mark had one of his arms outstretched. The two of them tiredly sat down with everyone surrounding them. "So this is how you got those rare elemental crystals," Shemetris said, staring at the psi crystal on Mark's arm. "If something like that existed in the past, gods would probably wage war for it." "Don't say something ominous." Mark sighed. "So, what do you all think of these?" Mark then showed the new crystals to everyone. And to no surprise, all of them tried to avoid touching the crystals by instinct. Even Shemetris was looking disgusted. "I don't think that is something to be consumed," Shemetris remarked, on which everyone agreed. Yes, literally everyone, even the 3 golems that seemed to move away from Mark when he showed the crystals. "Yeah, I agree too." Mark nodded. But then, Iola approached Mark, tapping on the psi crystal. "Papa, this is strange. The crystals made by the psi crystal should be safe to consume since it is supposed to remove the dangers from the energies it absorbed. But why are these crystals different?" Iola, to be exact, Keeper, was the previous owner and the creator of the psi crystal. Since it belonged to Keeper in the past, she should know its uses. Or at least, its uses in Arielis. But in that planet, while psychic energy became abundant during the apocalypse, as for magical energy, it was non-existent. The crystals that the psi crystal created in the past was also all clear and non-attributed. Now that it was able to absorb different attributes of energy, it was able to create new, never-before-seen crystals. "Maybe this is also safe to consume," Mark said. "For the proper people, at least. It's like how Spera can't consume attributed crystals other than the black-colored ones. Even Emihan can only consume wind attribute ones too." Iola nodded. That could be the case. Mark's family aside, the others were appalled by Iola and Mark's exchange. After all, they did not know anything about Arielis. Furthermore, Mark and Iola had memories of Freed and Keeper. They were the only people that could converse like this about the psi crystal. Of course, there was also Aphelia, who was not here. In any case, the job here was done. The birth of a new, formless demon was prevented. At least, here in the Philippines. It was sure that it would happen in other countries, and there was nothing they could do about it. "Let's get going. We should follow the trail we found last night," Mark said before he suddenly retracted his statement. "We should eat lunch first, I guess." Well, Mark changed his words because Abigail was already asking for food. After all, it was already almost noon.